Okay, so let's dive in. The date is June 9th, 2025, and we're working from these USA Today excerpts you've provided.
That's right. And our job today really is to unpack the main headlines from this material.
Exactly. Cut through the noise, figure out what your sources are telling us and what it might mean for you, purely based on this material.
And we've got, well, a couple of big areas today. There's some serious tension back home, a significant military deployment to talk about.
And then also these pretty high-stakes global trade talks happening right now. Today, in fact.
Yep. And we'll try to connect those dots, see what broader issues your sources are flagging.
Basically, this is your shortcut to getting up to speed on some key events shaping things this week, all based on what's in front of us here.
So let's kick off with the domestic situation. Los Angeles. Your sources paint a picture of a pretty tense weekend.
Right. The report details President Trump deploying 2,000 California National Guard troops. But the thing that immediately jumps out from the source material,
Is that it happened without Governor Newsom signing off on it. Not just without consent, but without even a specific request.
yeah, the source really hammers that point.
Mhm.
It says this was in response to protests over immigration raids.
And the methods described sound quite forceful. The report mentions tear gas, rubber bullets, used by federal forces.
In places like Compton and Paramount, yeah. And the source even notes tear gas hitting protesters on the freeway. That's quite an image.
It really is. But maybe the most arresting part, historically speaking, in this section of the source.
You mean the comparison it makes?
Exactly. The report explicitly calls this the first time Guard troops have been deployed by a president over state objections since Selma, 1965.
Wow. That really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? The source isn't just stating a fact there. It's signaling how significant this feels, at least from the perspective presented.
Precisely. It frames it as a potentially major moment in federal-state power dynamics, a rare assertion of federal authority.
And the source shows just how divided the reaction is. You've got critics quoted, like Governor Newsom, calling it an authoritarian power grab.
But then supporters, like VP Vance in the report, frame it as essential to restore order. The source lays out both sides pretty clearly.
It definitely highlights how contentious this is, just based on the provided text.
Okay, so while all that's happening in LA,
Right. Simultaneously, your sources shift focus across the Atlantic to London. Crucial trade talks. Also today, June 9th.
yes, high-level U.S. and Chinese delegations are meeting. The source mentions Treasury Secretary Bessent, Commerce Secretary Letnick.
And Trade Rep Greer are the key U.S. figures there. And this follows that recent talk between President Trump and President Xi.
And the agenda. It sounds like really core stuff based on the report.
Absolutely. Critical minerals like rare earths, semiconductors, and the possibility of rolling back some tariffs. These are big economic levers the source is pointing to.
Touching on tech, supply chains, major leverage points. And interestingly, the source notes an early positive market reaction, a 1% jump in the S&P 500, just on the initial buzz from these talks.
Shows how closely Wall Street is watching this specific negotiation, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Sees it as potentially quite significant.
Definitely. So when you put these two big stories together, the LA deployment and the London talks, what's the connecting thread your sources seem to suggest?
Well, it seems like the material frames, both within this broader context of maybe anxieties, concerns about federal power, the speed of response.
Yeah, the report kind of hints at underlying questions about federal overreach, both domestically and perhaps in how trade leverage is used.
And this leads to what I thought was maybe the most powerful takeaway from the source material.
The expert warning.
Exactly. The report includes this warning from experts that the precedent set by deploying the Guard in LA over state objections. This could fundamentally change federal-state relations for years.
That's huge. It takes the LA incident, according to these experts cited in your source, from just one event to potentially a real turning point, suggesting long-term shifts.
Really makes you think beyond just the immediate headlines. So to quickly recap the threads from your sources today.
We saw this highly unusual, historically flagged situation in Los Angeles, federal authority versus state objection.
Then, these critical economic talks in London focused on key strategic resources.
And underpinning it all, these expert warnings highlighted in your material about the potential long-term fallout for how federal and state governments interact.
And remember, this whole deep dive, this exploration, is based only on the USA Today excerpts you provided. It's a snapshot.
A snapshot of a moment where domestic power, global economics, and potentially constitutional dynamics are all kind of swirling together, according to the source.
Exactly. So keeping that expert warning from your source in mind about the precedent set in LA. Here's a final thought for you. What does this deep dive into your sources suggest about where federal-state relations might actually be heading? Something to chew on as you go about your day.